Chapter 1. The Princess in Exile. Princess Alara of the Vornithian Empire had never once in her life been told that she was anything but perfect, at least not until the time came for her to take her place among the stars as the heir to the great and expansive Vornithian Empire. As the only daughter of the Emperor, it was assumed that one day she would rule the entire Vornithian system, with its millions of planets, its complex networks of intergalactic trade, and its massive fleets of warships. It was a kingdom that stretched across a vast swath of space, a system that held power, influence, and history that spanned generations. The expectations of her were monumental, and the weight of a galaxy rested on her shoulders, as it was her destiny to follow in the footsteps of her father and take the throne of Vornith. Her name was a symbol of greatness. To be born as the child of the Emperor was to be destined for glory. The very essence of who she was and who she would become had been mapped out for her before her first breath. It seemed like fate had already decided everything for her. That was, of course, until the moment she was born and revealed something no one had expected. From the moment she emerged into the light, Alara's parents knew something was terribly wrong. While she looked like any other healthy Vornithian child in those early years, it didn't take long for the subtle signs of her ailment to manifest. The first symptoms appeared when she began to crawl. Unlike the rest of her species, her movements were slow, uncoordinated, and filled with a kind of hesitance that marked her as different. Her body wasn't responding as it should, and despite every attempt at medical intervention and advanced treatments from across the known universe, the doctors could offer nothing but a grim prognosis. Her physical disability was permanent, a genetic flaw that had been passed down through the royal bloodline. Her bones were fragile, her joints deteriorated far too early, and her body was simply not built to withstand the demands of the Vornithian lifestyle. As Alara grew, it became more and more apparent that she would never be the graceful, powerful leader her people had hoped for. The disease ravaged her from the inside out, and no matter how many treatments, surgeries, or advanced technologies were applied, nothing could heal her, nothing could reverse what was done. Her mobility was severely limited, her stature diminished compared to the strength and grace that her ancestors were known for. To make matters worse, in the Vornithian Empire, physical strength was paramount. Their people were a proud, physically formidable species, known throughout the galaxy for their immense strength and martial prowess. The idea of a weakened heir, one who couldn't even walk unaided, was anathema to the ideals of the Empire. As Alara's father watched his daughter struggle in her weakened state, the hope for her to one day become his successor withered and died. His disappointment was palpable, and even though he loved her, he could not hide the shame that consumed him. The once proud royal family of Vornith had to come to terms with the fact that their heir would never fulfill the expectations of the people. They needed someone strong, someone capable of leading the military, commanding the fleets, and making decisions with the power to carry out their will. In short, they needed a warrior, and Alara was no warrior. In time, this realization led to her exile. Despite the affection and the emotional ties she still shared with her family, Alara was removed from the public eye and kept out of the official royal duties. The Empire could not have a disabled princess. They could not have someone in line for the throne who could not fulfill the duties required of such a position. It was too much of a burden, one that the royal family and their empire could not bear. They had to ensure that the throne remained strong, the people remained satisfied, and the military continued to be the most powerful force in the galaxy. It was not cruelty, it was practicality. But for Alara, it was a crushing blow, and for a time, she questioned everything about herself. As the years went on, she lived her life away from the public eye, away from the grand halls of power that she had once believed would be hers. She lived in exile on a small, inconspicuous planet on the outer rim of the Empire, where no one could disturb her and no one could see the shameful weakness that had taken over her body. It was here, in the isolation of the unknown, that she began to understand her own value. Though she would never be a warrior, though she would never be the physical ruler her people had expected, she was still the blood of Vornith. Her mind was sharp, her intelligence profound, and she could still rule, just not in the way they had imagined. And so, she began to live in a way that defied her family's expectations, embracing the parts of herself that the Vornithian Empire had tried to suppress. Her physical disability remained, but it no longer consumed her. Alara learned to move gracefully in a new way. She found peace in her own skin, finding new purposes and meanings in the power of the mind. She studied political science, diplomacy, and leadership in exile, becoming a strategic mastermind, someone who could make decisions, influence others, and manipulate the power structures of the galaxy without lifting a sword. But it was always lonely. And then, one day, everything changed. As Alera's childhood passed into adolescence, she became more and more acutely aware of the quiet distance that had grown between her and her parents. At first, they tried to console her, assuring her that her condition would improve, that their finest doctors and the most advanced medical technologies would fix what had gone wrong. But as the years went by and her body failed to improve, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was different. Her body refused to cooperate with the high expectations that had been placed upon her since birth. Her father, once a proud and powerful emperor, began to distance himself emotionally from her, though never outwardly cruel. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. The Vornithians were a proud species, and in their culture, physical strength and capability were everything. If you weren't strong, you weren't seen as valuable. Alera came to understand this harsh truth quickly, even though it was never spoken aloud. Her mother, too, became more focused on the political intricacies of the empire and less on the well-being of her daughter. She began to view Alera as more of a symbol of failure than a princess with any real future. The moment Alera realized she would never take the throne was a quiet one, but it cut deep. She was standing in front of the holographic maps of the empire, watching her father address the council. His words were stirring, powerful, filled with promise. She remembered how, as a child, she had always dreamed of sitting beside him, of standing in front of the council as the future ruler of the Vornithian Empire. But that future was now a faraway dream. It was a dream she would never live. In that moment, Alera made a decision that would change the course of her life. She would no longer hold on to the illusion of leadership. She would find a new purpose, one where her disability did not define her, where her identity was not based solely on what others expected her to be. By the time she was 17, Alera had retreated to the outer rim of the empire, far from the palatial halls of her family's ancient fortress. Viridian 4 was a small, isolated planet, far enough removed from the galactic core that no one cared who she was, or that she was the princess of a dying empire. It was here that she would learn to live on her own terms. It was here that she would meet the people who would help her find a new path, a new destiny that didn't revolve around the throne she could never claim. For years, Alera lived a simple life, learning from the inhabitants of Viridian 4, far from the drama and politics of the Vornithian Empire. The planet's people, humble and resourceful, didn't care about royalty or the name she carried. They treated her with the same kindness and respect they treated everyone else, and for the first time in years, Alera found peace. She had little in terms of material wealth, but she had freedom, something she had never experienced in the confines of the palace. There was no pressure to live up to expectations, no constant surveillance from the palace, no guards watching her every move. It was just her and the people of Viridian 4, and for once, that felt like enough. Yet, despite the new life she had forged for herself, the memories of her past still haunted her. The weight of her royal blood, the knowledge that she was still the heir to an empire that had cast her aside, gnawed at her. No matter how hard she tried to suppress it, the truth of who she was would never fully fade. She would always be the last princess of the Vornithian Empire, the one who was never meant to rule, the one who was born into a lineage of warriors and leaders, only to be discarded because she was broken. Chapter 2. A Chance Encounter. It was on one of her frequent trips to the planet's capital that Alera encountered him. The city of Viridian was nothing like the grand capital of her former empire. It was a bustling, vibrant place, filled with markets, small shops, and the kind of humble energy that only a planet like Viridian could produce. It was a place where people worked hard for what they had, a place that celebrated life in all its raw and imperfect glory. There was no grandeur here, no expectations to live up to, but there was something about the city that made her feel alive. Alera had always liked the busy market square at the heart of the capital. The air was thick with the smell of fresh produce, exotic spices, and the sounds of people haggling for goods. It was a sensory overload, but a welcome one. On this particular day, she was walking through the marketplace, lost in the vibrant colors of the fabric stalls and the sounds of foreign languages being spoken by traders from all corners of the galaxy. Alara had come here to get away from the isolation of her home, to meet the people and experience the world beyond the quiet planet she called home. As she wandered through the crowd, her hand brushing against the stalls, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. A tightness, a stir of something unfamiliar. And then, she saw him. He wasn't like the other traders or locals. He stood out, not in his appearance, but in the way he moved, the way he carried himself. His dark hair was slightly messy, his clothes simple but well worn, and his eyes were full of something Alara had never seen before. It was as if they held a world of questions, of mysteries waiting to be unlocked. He didn't seem to care that the people around him were busy with their transactions, and there was a quiet intensity about him that immediately drew her in. It was as though he wasn't part of this world, yet he was completely at ease in it. For a moment, Alara stood frozen, watching him move through the market, his eyes scanning the crowd with a kind of quiet determination. She wasn't sure why, but there was something in his presence that made her heart beat faster, something that pulled her out of her usual shell of solitude. He wasn't just another stranger in the crowd. There was something different about him, something that made her feel, for the first time in years, that she wasn't invisible. As he passed her, their eyes met. It was a brief glance, just a fraction of a second, but it felt like an eternity. And in that instant, Alara realized something that made her pulse quicken. He wasn't looking at her like the others did. He wasn't seeing her as a princess, or as someone who had been cast aside. He was seeing her as a person, as someone who was capable of being more than what she had been reduced to. Before she could fully process what had just happened, the man approached her, his voice gentle but direct. "You look lost," he said, his tone surprisingly warm. "Can I help you with something?" Alara blinked, taken aback by his straightforwardness. She had spent so much time hiding, so much time in exile, that the last thing she expected was someone to approach her so casually. But his words, simple as they were, made her pause. "I'm not lost," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I'm just looking." He smiled at that, a small, knowing smile, and then took a step closer. "Looking for what?" he asked. Alara hesitated. For a moment, she considered giving him a typical, polite answer. Perhaps she'd say she was looking for some local produce, or just browsing the market for no particular reason. But something about him made her want to tell the truth. Something about his presence made her want to strip away the layers of formality that she had built around herself. "For something more," she said quietly, almost to herself. His eyes softened at her words, and he seemed to consider her carefully for a moment before nodding. "That's a good answer," he said softly, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of something deeper. "I think we're all looking for something more, aren't we?" Alara's heart fluttered in her chest at the simplicity of his words, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if this was the beginning of something or if it was simply another fleeting encounter. But in that moment, standing in the middle of the busy marketplace, surrounded by the noise of the galaxy, and yet alone with this strange man, Alara knew that something had shifted. The walls she had built around herself began to crack, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that she could find something more. Alara stood still in the crowded market, still processing the words the stranger had just spoken. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as if sensing her hesitation. There was a depth to his eyes, something unspoken, something almost too profound for a chance meeting in a bustling marketplace. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade into the background as Alara became acutely aware of the quiet space between them, filled only by the subtle sounds of the market and the far-off hum of hovercrafts gliding overhead. For the first time in a long while, Alara felt something shift deep within her, a stir of curiosity, a pulse of longing. It wasn't just his words that struck her. It was the way he saw her. The way he didn't just see the princess or the broken heir of the Vornithian Empire. He saw her, the person she had spent years burying beneath layers of titles and expectations. He saw through the wall she had built around herself. Alara started, then paused. She had intended to explain herself, to give him a polite dismissal, as was her habit. But something about the calm, easy manner of the human before her made it impossible to simply turn away. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for," she finally admitted, her voice soft. "Maybe I'm just hoping to find something I didn't think existed." The stranger nodded, his smile growing just a little wider, as if he understood more than she had said. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the hardest part is figuring out what that something really is." Alara blinked, surprised by the understanding in his voice. He was a stranger, and yet it felt like he had known her longer than she had known herself. There was no expectation in his words, no pressure, just an open invitation to explore something, anything, that had been buried deep inside her for too long. She shook her head, as if to clear her thoughts. I don't know if I can explain it. I don't think anyone can. The stranger stepped closer, though still respectful of her personal space. His eyes searched her face for a moment. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, more intimate. Sometimes, you don't need to explain it. Sometimes, the right person is the one who will ask the right question, and then everything falls into place. For a long moment, they stood there, the air thick with something unspoken, something powerful. Alera's pulse quickened, though she couldn't tell if it was out of fear or anticipation. She had never been one to indulge in feelings of vulnerability, especially not when her position as a royal had so often required her to be composed, to be perfect. Yet in this moment, with this human stranger, something within her cracked open, revealing a rawness she had long kept hidden. The man took another step forward, his voice lowering to a near whisper. I don't want anything from you, princess. But I do want to ask you something. Alera's breath caught in her throat. He knew who she was, and it didn't seem to faze him. It wasn't as if she had expected otherwise. Her royal status was a part of her, something she could never escape. But the fact that he had spoken so plainly, without reverence, without the awe that so many others had when they first learned of her identity, startled her. Ask me, she repeated. The man nodded. Will you mate with me? Alera blinked, the question striking her like a bolt of lightning. For a moment, her mind couldn't process the words. Was he joking? Was this some kind of trick? She was about to say something, to protest, but something in his eyes stopped her. There was no mocking in his gaze, no amusement. He was serious. And yet, there was an underlying tenderness in his expression that made her heart flutter, an emotion she couldn't quite place. What? She stammered. The words felt foreign on her tongue, unfamiliar, yet curiously liberating. Why would you ask that? He tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. Because you deserve to choose. Because I see beyond the things that others can't. And because, even though you may not believe it, I think you can find someone who will accept you completely, who won't look at you with pity or expectation. His voice softened further, a warmth to it now. Someone who will value you, not for what you can give or what you can do, but for who you are. The shock of his words took a while to settle within her, but when they did, Alera found herself unable to reply immediately. She had been offered many things in her life: treatment for her condition, political alliances, marriage proposals, and strategies for a future she would never have. But no one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever asked her for something so intimate, so vulnerable, so personal. She didn't know whether to feel insulted, confused, or relieved. I don't think you understand, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not like the others. My condition dash. I don't care about your condition, he interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. What I care about is you. The person you are, the person you can be, not the title or the bloodline that's been forced upon you. Alera felt the weight of his words settle deep into her chest, and for the first time in years, she wondered if she had been wrong about everything. The walls she had built around herself, the protective armor she had crafted to shield herself from a world that didn't understand her, all of it had crumbled with those simple words. Was it possible that someone could truly see her not as a disabled princess, not as the broken heir to a throne, but as a woman, a person deserving of her own chance at happiness? Chapter 3. A Choice of the Heart. The days that followed that strange encounter were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. Alera found herself unable to focus on anything but the man who had appeared so suddenly in her life, the human who had dared to ask her the question no one had ever asked her before. His words echoed in her mind, each repetition shifting something inside of her. He had seen her not for the disability that kept her grounded, not for the royal title that shackled her to a life of expectations, but for who she was, a person who had dreams and desires just like everyone else. At first, she tried to dismiss him. After all, what did she truly know about him? He was a stranger, someone from a world so far removed from hers, someone who had no stake in her life, in her past. He had no reason to care about her, especially not in the way he claimed to. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore him, she found herself thinking about him. Every encounter in the marketplace, every moment they had shared, played in her mind like a film she couldn't turn off. One evening, After hours spent in solitude in her quarters, Alara sat by the window, gazing out at the stars. She had always been drawn to the night sky, its vastness making her feel small, but in a comforting way. It reminded her that no matter how isolated she felt, no matter how disconnected from her past, the universe was still so much larger than her problems. There was a sense of freedom in the stars. And tonight, as she stared into the infinite space beyond, she found herself wondering what it would be like to actually experience that freedom. To live without the chains of her royal bloodline, without the constant reminders of what she couldn't do. The knock on the door startled her, and for a moment, she froze, unsure of who it could be. But deep down, she already knew. When she opened the door, the human was standing there once more. His face was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made her heart flutter, something she hadn't expected. He was there again, just like he had promised. He wasn't running away from her, not because of her disability or her past, but because of who she was in the moment. I've thought about your offer, Alara said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up at him. And I've realized that maybe I've spent too much time running from what I want, from what I deserve. He smiled softly, the kind of smile that made her chest tighten. You don't have to be afraid of wanting what you deserve. No one has the right to tell you what that should be. In that moment, Alara made her decision. She wasn't sure what the future held, or if this was the right choice. But she knew she couldn't keep denying herself the chance to live, to feel, to experience the things she had once thought were impossible. Then yes, she said, her voice steady now. I will. The days following Alara's decision were a whirlwind of emotions, introspection, and unexpected connections. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time in years, she could see the world with clarity and purpose. The simple decision to accept the human's offer, to choose something for herself, felt like a monumental shift in her existence. No longer was she just the disabled princess in exile, the heir to an empire that had cast her aside. Now, she was a woman with choices, with a future that she could shape on her own terms. The human, whose name she learned was Liam, had been patient with her in the days that followed. He never pushed, never demanded anything from her, yet his presence was a constant, steady force that provided her with the security and encouragement she needed. He had no grand intentions, no manipulative schemes. He didn't see her as a princess or as the last of her royal bloodline. He saw her as a person, a woman deserving of her own happiness, and that was something Alara had never experienced before. As they spent more time together, she began to open up in ways she hadn't even realized were possible. Liam asked her questions about her life, her past, her hopes, and instead of the usual pity or awkwardness, he listened intently, as though every word she spoke was a treasure. In return, Alara found herself asking him questions she hadn't even thought to ask before. What was it like to come from a world so different from hers? What were his dreams, his desires? How could someone from such a different culture, someone who had no stake in the Vornithian Empire, care so deeply about her? Their conversations flowed easily, naturally, and with each passing day, Alara began to feel something stir within her that she had long forgotten: hope. For the first time in a long while, she started to believe that maybe she was more than just the sum of her scars, more than just a broken princess who had been forgotten by her own people. She was capable of love, of desire, of living her life to the fullest. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. One evening, as the sky above Viridian 4 shifted into a rich, deep purple with the fading of the twin suns, Alara and Liam sat outside on the balcony of her modest home, a soft breeze stirring the air around them. The hum of distant machinery and the sounds of nature filled the silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that came from being with someone who understood you, someone who saw you as you truly were. Alara turned toward Liam, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been one to speak openly about her emotions, never allowed herself to express vulnerability in such a raw way. But tonight, something within her urged her to take that leap. She had spent so long trying to protect herself from the world, from the disappointment of her family and the rejection of her people. But now, she was standing on the edge of something new, something that wasn't defined by the past or by the limitations that had been imposed upon her. I never thought I could feel like this, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I never thought I could want someone, the way I want you. I've spent so many years hiding, so many years convinced that I didn't deserve this. Happiness. Liam turned to her, his expression softening as he reached out to take her hand in his. You deserve everything, Alara. Everything you want, everything you've ever dreamed of. You've been through so much, and yet you've kept going. You're stronger than you think. Alara looked down at their intertwined hands, a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel broken. She didn't feel like the fragile, disabled princess who had been cast aside. She felt like a woman, full of potential, full of life, with a future she could control. And for the first time, she felt safe enough to admit what she had been too afraid to say for so long. I want this, Liam, she said, her voice steady now, filled with the weight of her words. I want to be with you. Not because I'm broken, but because I'm ready. I'm ready to live, to love, to be seen for who I am, not who I was supposed to be. Liam smiled, his eyes warm with affection. You don't have to be anything other than yourself, Alara. You've already given me everything I need, and I'm not going anywhere. The words, simple as they were, meant more to Alara than anything else in the galaxy. In them, she found a reassurance that she hadn't even known she needed. It wasn't about her disability. It wasn't about her royal lineage. It was about her, the person she had become, the person she was choosing to be. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. Days turned into weeks, and as Alara and Liam spent more time together, their bond deepened. It was as though they had both been waiting for this moment, this connection, and neither of them was willing to let go of the opportunity that had presented itself so unexpectedly. The time they spent together was no longer just about mutual understanding or emotional support. It became something more, something intimate, something that transcended the physical boundaries they both had been taught to fear. Alara was no longer the princess hiding in exile. She was a woman discovering her own desires, her own capacity for love and connection. The man she had once seen as a stranger had become her partner, not just in body, but in spirit. Liam saw her not as someone broken or flawed, but as someone capable of great strength and beauty. In him, she found a love she had never dared hope for, and in herself, she found the courage to embrace it fully. One evening, as they stood together beneath the star-filled sky of Viridian 4, Liam turned to her, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Alara felt a wave of warmth spread through her chest as she looked into his eyes. There was no need for words in this moment. Everything had been said already, through the shared looks, the quiet touch of his hand, the unspoken promises between them. Will you stay with me? Liam asked softly, his voice filled with an emotion that made Alara's heart swell. Alara didn't need to think about it. She already knew the answer. Yes, she whispered, her voice steady and filled with certainty. I want to stay with you. I want this us. And in that moment, as the stars above them twinkled like a million tiny promises, Alara knew that she had finally found her place in the galaxy. She wasn't just the last princess of the Vornithian Empire. She was Alara, a woman who had found her own path, her own purpose, and her own happiness. And with Liam by her side, there was no limit to what she could achieve. As the days passed, the reality of Alara's decision began to settle within her. She had found something more than she could have ever expected, someone who saw her not for her status, her disability, or the expectations that had weighed her down for so long, but someone who loved her for who she was, in her entirety. She felt the weight of years of solitude lifting off her shoulders, and the air around her began to feel lighter. There were no more moments of hiding, no more pretending to be someone she wasn't. For the first time in a long while, she felt whole. The time they spent together was filled with a sense of peace and discovery. They explored the quiet beauty of Viridian 4, wandering through lush forests and peaceful lakes, far from the noise of the galactic politics that had once dominated her life. Though Alara still grappled with the whispers of her past, the memories of a broken empire, and the weight of royal blood that had once been her burden, she found herself growing stronger with every passing day. Liam's support was unwavering, and his belief in her became the foundation upon which she built a new life. Together, they ventured to distant parts of the planet, learning from one another, experiencing joy in the smallest of moments. They shared stories, dreams, and desires. And with each passing day, their bond grew deeper. One evening, as the twin moons of Viridian 4 cast a silver glow across the landscape, Alara and Liam sat side by side, watching the stars flicker in the distance. The cool night air wrapped around them, and for a brief moment, Alara allowed herself to lean into the comfort of his presence, savoring the peace they had found. She had come so far from the princess in exile, the woman trapped by expectations and limitations, and now she was a woman in love, free to create her own destiny. "I never thought it would be like this," Alara said, her voice soft as she turned to face Liam, the man who had changed everything for her. "I never thought I could feel this way. I thought I was destined for something else, something darker." Liam smiled, his hand gently brushing against hers. "You're not destined for darkness, Alara. You've always had the power to choose your own path, and now, you're choosing to live the life you deserve." Alara felt her heart swell as she took his hand in hers, the words she had longed to hear finally becoming a reality. She wasn't bound to her past, to the pain, to the abandonment. She wasn't the princess of a broken empire anymore. She was free, and with Liam by her side, she felt like she could conquer anything. The silence between them felt comfortable, filled with understanding and the warmth of shared affection. And yet, as the night stretched on, Alara's mind wandered back to the life she had left behind. There would be no return to the throne, no reclaiming the empire she had been born to rule. That part of her life was gone, buried beneath the ashes of a past that was no longer relevant to who she had become. She had chosen a different path, and that was enough. But there was still a part of her, deep inside, that wondered about the future. What would it hold for her, for Liam, for the world she had left behind? She would never again wear the crown of the Vornithian Empire, but perhaps, she realized, there were other ways to lead. Other ways to make a difference in the universe. She had a power, a voice, a presence, and it could be used for something meaningful. "Liam," she said, her voice full of determination, "I've been thinking." He turned to her, his eyes filled with curiosity. "What about?" "I've been thinking about what comes next," Alara continued, her words coming faster now, as if the possibilities had finally unlocked in her mind. "I know I'm not meant to take the throne. I know that part of my life is over. But that doesn't mean I'm done. There's so much more to be done in this galaxy. I can make a difference, Liam. Not as a princess or a ruler, but as someone who cares about the people who have been left behind. There's so much that's broken in the galaxy, so much that needs to be rebuilt. And maybe, just maybe, I can be the one to help fix it." Liam listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. Then, after a long pause, he smiled. "You're already making a difference, Alara. You've already changed my life, and I know you're capable of doing so much more. Whatever path you choose, I'll be with you." Her heart swelled with gratitude and love as she gazed into his eyes, knowing that their future together was still unwritten, still full of possibilities. Alara had been born into a life of privilege and duty, but it had been a life that had never truly been her own. Now, for the first time, she felt like she could write her own story. She could take her experiences, her pain, and her strength, and use them to make the galaxy a better place. She was more than the princess who had been abandoned. She was a woman, a force in her own right, and she could change the universe if she wanted to. The night stretched on, and the two of them sat together in the quiet of Viridian 4, watching the stars above them. In that peaceful moment, Alara realized that she had found something far more precious than a throne or a title. She had found love, purpose, and freedom. And as long as she had Liam by her side, there was nothing she couldn't face.